I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Viva International.
Viva International welcomes the report of the High Commissioner on Sri Lanka and expresses her concern about the human rights situation, especially the lack of independent and democratic institutions, militarization of the country, reprisals against families of disappeared persons, and persecution of the human rights defenders. We draw special attention to the Easter Sunday attacks that took place in 2019 on several hotels and churches. This was the biggest post-war massacre that cost the lives of 269 persons, including 47 foreigners. 21 of the 22 volumes of the report of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry have not yet been made public, and the government has not taken all necessary steps to implement the significant recommendations that come from the only volume made public. We support the High Commissioner recommendations and urge all member states of the Human Rights Council to support the continuation of gathering of evidence of such crimes and abuses initiated by the Council last year, use universal jurisdiction for crimes committed in Sri Lanka, and establish an international independent tribunal for Sri Lanka, including the Easter Sunday attacks. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of World Evangelical Alliance. Please.
President, the World Evangelical Alliance welcomes the written update of the High Commissioner. Violence against religious minorities continues in Sri Lanka with impunity. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to hold accountable those who commit violence against religious minorities. We also call on the government to repeal bans on full face covering and cattle slaughter. We also urge the government of Sri Lanka to desist from mandating any form of registration of places of worship and to rescind the 2008 circular on prior permission for construction and registration of places of worship. This circular is currently misused to intimidate members of religious minorities. Finally, we are gravely concerned by the lack of political will to achieve justice for the victims of the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings, which killed 270 people, including at the Evangelical Zion Church on the island of Batikaloa and at Catholic churches. We echo the call of the High Commissioner to the government of Sri Lanka to publish the findings of the Commission of Inquiry into the Easter Sunday bombings and to pursue further independent investigation. And we ask the High Commissioner what additional and immediate steps she recommends that the government of Sri Lanka takes to ensure that justice is served for the Easter bombing victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Mr. President, Amnesty International welcomes the UNCHR report highlighting the continued lack of accountability, the lack of recognition of victims' rights, and other trends that continue to impede reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Amnesty remains deeply concerned by the shrinking civic space and urges the government to halt reprisals against critics and perceived critics, including those advocating for justice for the tragic April 2019 bombings. Families of the disappeared continue to face obstacles and pushback from state agents while they demand their right to truth and justice, including through the state's pursuit of court orders attempting to restrict their freedom to protest. The state's alarming discrimination and targeting of the Muslim community continues unabated. Amnesty continues to call for an immediate moratorium on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which continues to be used to detain hundreds, particularly minorities, for prolonged periods without charge or trial. Repeated attempts to amend the Act have proved futile, including the latest iteration of amendments that fail to address critical gaps in the law to bring it in line with international law. While we welcome court decisions to grant bail to selected PTA detainees, hundreds more still languish in detention without access to bail. Sri Lankan authorities must ensure that all those still detained have access to fair bail hearings and must release those not yet charged with recognisable crimes under international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Representative of International Commission of Jurists to give the floor.
The ICJ welcomes the OHCHR's wide-ranging report. We appreciate its recognition of the heavy militarization of civilian functions, including the widespread appointment of senior military figures into positions of administrative authority and the need for independence of the Attorney General's Department. In the past year, the human rights situation in Sri Lanka has only deteriorated further. The government's refusal to ensure accountability for crimes under international law and the release of several high-ranking military personnel suspected of such crimes indicate continued systematic impunity. Surveillance and harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and activists have increased. Impunity for cases of enforced disappearances and intimidation of the victims' families by security forces continue. Extrajudicial killings by police have sharply risen, and Tamil and Muslim prisoners have been particularly vulnerable to ill treatment and torture in detention, in one instance committed by a state minister. Cases of arbitrary detention have increased, and the PTA, despite calls for its repeal, continues to be used. The government's refusal to repeal the PTA and the continued impunity for violations of international law are illustrative of its general unwillingness to engage in real accountability measures. Madam High Commissioner, what further steps can OHCHR take to press the government to fulfill its commitments to accountability? Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, please.
Madam President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada appreciates the OHCHR's report on Sri Lanka. We note the concerns about the continued lack of accountability for past human rights violations in Sri Lanka, the alarming trends toward majoritarianism that undermine democratic institutions, and the pattern of intimidation and threats towards human rights defenders and victims. As noted in the report, the government of Sri Lanka has failed to establish any credible pathways for transitional justice towards accountability and reconciliation. The families of the disappeared have faced extensive harassment and surveillance by security agents in efforts to hinder their access to truth, justice, and reparations. We have previously raised concerns about the arrest and detention of Hejaz Hezbollah, a lawyer and vocal advocate for the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. While recently ordered released by the court, Mr. Hezbollah spent close to 2 years arbitrarily detained without trial under Sri Lanka's draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act. This case is a clear example of the need to repeal the PTA. We reiterate our calls upon the Council to seek the referral of the situation of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court and urge member states to investigate and prosecute international crimes committed in Sri Lanka through domestic judicial proceedings utilizing the principles of universal jurisdiction. Thank you, Madam President.
I give the floor. Thank you very much.